Hello, everyone. Hope you are all doing great. We're really excited to host this session today. Depending on your time zones from where you have joined in, hope you have hydrated yourself, had some food, and we are really looking forward to this session going forward. I'm sure that all of you are having a great time and very much geared up for this session where we are going to take a surgical approach to dissect the medical discourse and around our bodies. We hope to collectively understand the side effects of consuming such prescriptive knowledge pills. And by end of the session, we hope that there will be some concrete thoughts for better prognosis. I would like to share some logistical information up front. As you can see on the bottom left of your screen, our Indian Sign Language interpreter is here to translate the entire session. In addition to that, we have translations available in Bengali and Hindi. To access either of these languages, please find the globe icon at the bottom of your screen and choose your preferred language. Please do remember to mute the original audio while you are using these translations. We would request all of the attendees to be respectful of people and their opinions. We would love this session to be in a safe space while having an open conversation. There will be a Q&A at the end of the session. Attendees can post their question answers in the box also, and the moderator would definitely address them. Without further ado, I would like to introduce our amazing panelists. First is Dr. Aqsa Shaikh, who is an out and proud trans woman. She is an associate professor of community medicine, nodal officer for COVID Vaccination Center, Hamdard Institute of Medical Sciences and Research. Aqsa is one of the investigators in the clinical trial of Sputnik V and investigator in Transgender Project and WHO's Unity studies on COVID. She is a co-investigator in transgender studies on health access and medical curriculum at Sangat Institute, India. Aqsa is a founding director of Human Solidarity Foundation. Welcome, Dr. Aqsa, to this session. Second is Dr. Payoshni Mitra, who is a former badminton player and coach. Dr. Mitra is a prominent athlete rights activist and leading campaigner in the abolition of sex testing policies in women's sport, working closely with affected athletes across Asia and Africa to enable them to address human rights violations in sports. Mitra was instrumental in helping Indian athlete Ms. Duti Chand challenge the hyperandrogenism regulations at the Court of Arbitration for Sport in 2014 and 15 as the government-appointed advisor to Chand. She was also one of the 10-member expert team who testified for South African athlete Caster Semenya at the CS earlier this year. Mitra had been consulted on gender and sports issues of inclusion in sport by national governments, the International Olympic Committee, Council of Europe, Office of High Commissioner of Human Rights, and has recently collaborated with Human Rights Watch to publish the most extensive research on lived experiences of athletes with variations in sex characteristics. Mitra is a director and trustee at the Center for Sport and Human Rights in Geneva and is a member with the Women's Sport International. Welcome, Dr. Mitra. Next is Dr. Sanjida Arora, who is a research officer at SEHAT. SEHAT carries out socially relevant and rigorous academic health research and health action for the well-being of the disadvantaged masses. The thrust of SEHAT's work is to recognize violence as a public health issue, making the health system accountable to violence against women and establish modes of psychosocial healthcare for women and children survivors. I would like also to take this opportunity to introduce our wonderful moderator for this session, Dr. Sana Contractor. Dr. Sana Contractor is a public health researcher and practitioner with an MPH from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health and over a decade's experience in health systems research in India. Her body of work in the domain of sexual and reproductive rights focuses on its intersections with identity and social exclusion, and interrogates policymaking from local to global health spaces using this lens. Dr. Contractor has worked with leading rights-oriented research organizations and has published in national and international academic journals. She has also been associated with feminist and health rights movements in India. Welcome, Dr. Sana. And so let's begin our operation, I guess. And over to you, Dr. Sana. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Souvik. It's a pleasure to be here at the Love, Sex and Data conference, and for that lovely introduction to all of us and also to what the session is going to be about. Good afternoon, good morning, good evening, wherever you are. Welcome to this session. It's called Let's Play Doctor Doctor. And for the next 90 minutes, we'll be talking about medicalization, the body and data. I don't know about you, but when I was a child, playing the role of doctor in Dr. Doctor was always one of the most prestigious ones. And even at that age, one knew that doctors held authority. They were to be respected. They held knowledge that mere mortals like us would probably never have access to. And in fact, even now as an adult, even after having trained as a dental surgeon, even after having worked in hospitals and public health environments for more than 15 years, when I walk into a doctor's office, I'm slightly worried about being scrutinized by this person who in that space obviously holds more power than me. And this power is to subject me to their gaze and pronounce me as normal or not. And that normal or abnormal, atypical or typical is not just a factual assertion. It has a lot of value judgments built into it. There's a certain pathology implicit in it. And also alongside that, the power to fix the issue that you have. And in fact, in the field of sex and pleasure, which is what this conference is all about, that has largely been the approach of the profession, which is to pathologize behaviors and then to find a way to fix them with some sort of drug or technology or what have you. Medicine and science, I guess, more generally holds that sense of authority in our worlds. We think of them as having the power to ascertain truths because they do experimentation and things like that. And we think that that does not have any inbuilt bias. But the truth is that medical sciences, much like all other aspects of our world, are ridden with all sorts of biases. Historically, in fact, science and medicine has played a role in justifying all sorts of untruths. And the medical profession, even now, is dominated by those with great social privilege. And the entry of those without privilege, as we know, is vehemently opposed and thwarted. In this session that we are now going to get into, we want to examine the ways in which this definition of normal and abnormal, atypical and typical is propagated and enforced through medicalization. Our panelists are health professionals, researchers, and activists who have witnessed firsthand the consequences of boxing individuals into these arbitrary but scientifically determined categories. Through their work, they have also been spearheading efforts to challenge the status quo in various ways and shift the discourse on what is normal and abnormal, both within and outside the field of medicine. Souvik has already introduced our three speakers. So I will first up call upon Sanjida, who is a dentist and researcher with Sehat, and she's been studying medical curricula and working with medical educators to integrate gender into their teaching. So yeah, Sanjida, can you tell us about how the medical sciences view gender and sex? What are some of the inherent biases in what is imagined as normal and abnormal vis-a-vis gender, and how does this play out in clinical practice? Over to you.
Thank you, Sana. So the larger issue with the medical education training and the service provision and also the public health services in India is that there is lack of recognition of social determinants of health. When I say a lack of understanding of the social determinants of health, I mean that all the patients walking into a hospital are considered as a homogeneous community. The fact that the people experience health differently based on their social location, like caste, class, gender, or the marital status, or the sexual orientation, and so on, is not considered while providing care to the patient. And often the healthcare providers use sex and the gender terms interchangeably. And also this results in a lot of gender-based stereotypes and biases while providing the care. Just to give the examples, the the provision of clinical care to the women is largely based on the research which is done on the males, right? Often uh, males are considered as more forthcoming and precise as far as the articulation of the symptoms are concerned. Many a times the doctors would like to talk to the relatives of the female patients in order to talk about a complicated surgery. They never do this for a surgery of a male patient. And if you see, so this also results in sometimes labeling the symptoms of the women as psychosomatic, and sometimes the over medicalization of the natural events like childbirth, right? And in the context of the GBV, the gender-based violence, such an approach has implications, because if a woman is facing violence, is coming to a health clinic or a hospital, often the approach of the doctor or the nurse is to provide symptomatic relief without addressing the root causes of those problems. And so this kind of the approach doesn't meet the care that is required by the women. For example, a lot of times the young women, they get admitted to the hospitals with the complaint of accidental consumption of the poison, right? Doctors, they know that the patient can't consume the whole bottle of the poison without accidentally, without knowing what it is. They know, but they don't make any effort to ask women that why she drank the whole bottle of the poison, what were the underlying causes for those. They are basically recorded as the cases of accidental consumption of poison, and they are actually the cases of attempted suicide, and the healthcare system doesn't put any effort to understand the causes and even to address the aftermath of such a attempt to end their life, right? Many a times we have seen that the survivors of the domestic violence, they land up in the hospital with the repeated attempts to suicide because they are not provided adequate comprehensive care at the the first time. Similarly, if you look at the medical legal examination of the survivors of the sexual violence, a lot of times the examination is done in a mechanical manner. So when I say mechanical manner, there is no importance given to the history of the women, the kind of the assault that happened, what were the circumstances of the assault, whether she was intoxicated or not, whether she was drugged or not, why she could not resist the assault. All these considerations are not there, and mechanically they collect the swabs like anal swabs, oral swabs, vaginal swabs. Even if the woman is not giving the history that this kind of the assault happened or this kind of the assault didn't happen. Yeah, another example is this kind of approach is the abuse and the mistreatment faced by the women coming for the childbirth. So we termed it as an obstetric violence or the labor room violence. So if they don't consider the social political the ecological circumstances around the patient, then they often provide biased treatment. Like for example, a lot of biases are there among the providers about the multiparous women, about the women of a particular religious minority. Yeah, also the mistreatment in the labor room, like for example, not allowing women to drink water in the labor room, not allowing them to walk, and then not allowing the birth companion in the labor room. They are not allowed to meet anyone in the labor room. All these biased practices actually add more actually jeopardize the healthcare provision to the women. Yeah, so these are the few examples that I would like to highlight.
Thanks so much, Sanjida. I think you very nicely elaborated on how this plays out in the clinical practice, because we often think that because doctors and scientists are objective sort of beings, they will do things that seem most obvious, or they will be able to see these correlations. But because they also belong to the society like everybody else, there is probably as much possibility for them to engage in these sort of practices, and in a lot of ways also justify them, saying that these are in fact not their role, or going beyond this is not their role, and they are only doing what is being what is their role as a treatment person or as a legal advisor or what have you. So yeah, thanks so much for that. I think building on what Sanjida has said, Dr. Aqsa, would you be able to elaborate on the ways in which medicine per se views trans persons, and what does it imagine as normal? Can you also talk about how it impacts how trans persons are viewed in medical research, since that is something that you're involved in, and the sort of intersections that has with law and public policy, and of course the health system itself?
Yeah, thanks, Sana. I would like to first start with a comment on, the brave situation which Dr. Sanjida mentioned, and just adding a point to that, when it comes to the history given by women, or when it comes to suicidal ideation or attempts by women, it's often considered frivolous. It's not, it's considered that they are doing this just to seek attention. They don't really mean to do it, or they are not serious about it. Or even when it comes to taking history, it's often neglected as something not very serious, and the history is often asked from the male relatives or the elderly women, who accompany them. So this just shows that how much of implicit bias is there in the minds of the young doctors also, who have seen their senior doctors do this, and this is how therefore they behave. When it comes to trans persons, I would like to first start by telling what do we mean by the trans persons, who are trans persons, because some of the audience may have an understanding of trans persons and would really want that to be set right at this stage. So trans persons are those whose gender identity is different from the sex which was assigned to them at birth. So if there is a person who was assigned male sex at birth and now identifies as a woman, then they are a trans woman. But there are people who do not box themselves in the binary of male and female, and you also have the gender non-conforming persons there. When it comes to the legal definition as per the Transgender Persons Act, then that definition also includes the socio-ethnic groups like the Hijra, Kinnar, Aravani communities. And it also has put in the transgender category the intersex persons. Now, the intersex persons are, persons with differences in sexual characteristics and variations basically in that. This is something different from the transness, but unfortunately in our law, both have been boxed together. And this just shows how conflated is the understanding of our lawmakers, when it comes to gender identity versus sexual characteristics, that they do not understand the difference between sex and gender, as Sanjida was also mentioning about it. So when it comes to trans persons or even the intersex persons, we are often zeroed in down to our bodies. The understanding is that the trans persons or intersex persons have different bodies as compared to the typical male body and the female body. And something which is different and something which is not understood is often feared, is pathologized, is stigmatized, and is then later experimented upon to correct it so as to fit it into the binaries of males and females. We have seen that often happening with the intersex babies, in which case their parents sometimes, are not very comfortable with having a child who does not fit into the category of either a boy or a girl. They don't know what to tell their relatives, what they have got. They just simply can't say they've got a child, a beautiful child. They want one part, one definition, and then often there are these unnecessary sex normalizing surgeries which are being conducted on these intersex babies, which can have a harmful effect on their body, on their psyche, and may not match with their gender identity, about which they become aware a few years later.
Yeah.
So you are actually artificially creating trans children in the case of intersex children by deciding their gender even before they had a chance to decide on that or to understand it. When it comes to the trans persons, historically, there has been a revolt against the trans bodies, and this you can see in the British era when they enacted the Dangerous Tribes Act. Otherwise, the trans persons were quite, in sync with the Indian society, and even during the Mughal Empire. And that continued for the entire British era. And now we also see the remnants of it in the current laws, which reduces the trans persons to their bodies. It also can be seen in the case of the other queer identities like homosexual persons, lesbian and gay identifying persons, where we had Section 377 for more than 70 years in existence, post-independence, and it's only last 3 years when the Section 377 was read down, and finally, this became legal to have consensual sex between two adults. So there has been often a struggle with the bodies. Now, what is dangerous and precedent which has been set is that now we have a law, and that law does not recognize the trans persons in terms of their gender identity, but in terms of their bodies. So just to give an example, if a trans person like me, for example, who was assigned male sex at birth and who wants to have a female identity, I cannot get a female gender identity marker until and unless I have undergone a surgery through which I have gotten rid of my male organs and somehow, acquired an externally looking female anatomy. Now, the problem with this is that not all trans persons want to undergo gender affirming surgery. Not all trans men, especially, can afford the surgery. And when I say afford, in terms of the cost and in terms of the side effects, which there can be on their bodies. So not all people will have that level of dysphoria that they want a surgery. Not all people want their bodies, to be boxed into those binaries. But unfortunately, the law forces you to do that. And until unless you have a particular gender marker, the various laws which are associated with that gender, for example, medical termination of pregnancy, marriage, artificial reproductive technology, adoption, surrogacy, none of these become applicable to you. And when it comes to the trans persons, there are no laws which mention about the trans persons vis-a-vis all these, civil rights or biological rights. So it's a situation which forces trans persons to change their bodies against their wish to get the state benefits. And, the entire focus is on sex reassignment surgery. So there's a latest news now that the Ayushman Bharat, which provides financial benefits for doing surgeries, has also included these sex reassignment surgeries into its domain. But what is not included is mental health support. What is not included is counseling. What is not included is counseling of the parents of the intersex persons. And these are very important things. It's not just about bodies, it's about our identities.
Yeah, absolutely. Thanks so much for bringing that up. And that's a good segue into the next speaker, Payoshni Mitra, who's dealing with very similar issues, but in a very different world, which is the world of sport. So, Payoshni, if you can give us a sense of how does this definition of typical and atypical impact athletes, and what is the experience of athletes? What do they have to go through? And also, what is the role of the medical profession in this entire thing? Because as Dr. Aqsa said, health professionals are probably involved in making a decision about who is normal and who is not. If you can speak about it, would be great. Thanks, Payoshni.
Thank you so much, Sana. I'm really grateful to be part of this wonderful panel and really sort of learning a lot from both Dr. Sanjida and Dr. Sahi present here. I would be talking about sport, as you just said, and sport is on one hand not outside the society, but on the other hand, sport interestingly reinforces a lot of things that we are questioning in this panel. So one of the things that we need to understand is when we are talking about high performance sport, it is essentially traditionally has been um, has had a binary model. So the male female binary that we see in the larger society is kind of emphasized, reinforced in the context of high performance sport. And that makes the work that I do even more complex because we in sport governing bodies are constantly trying to define these categories. Now, when we are talking about the men's category, there is less anxiety because men can be as strong as they want to. But when there is a woman who is strong, who's really good, who's really running fast, then questions are raised about her. Is she woman enough? Is the question that is raised. So the area that I have been working on last more than a decade now, it has been with women who have variations in sex characteristics. There has been different kinds of terms that has been used historically. In the past, we would say these were sex testing policies. There was a time when they would call it gender verification tests. And then at some point, the International Olympic Committee and the World Athletics, which is the international governing body for athletics, they sort of accepted that gender cannot be determined. However, for example, FIFA, which is the governing body for football, still has a gender verification regulations. So it's interesting that it's not sort of entirely the same in every sport, and how different sports are governed differently as well. But we do have these different kinds of tests. They're almost similar. They're earlier sex testing, sex control. That's how they used to define it. Now, in the middle, they started calling it hyperandrogenism regulations. At this point, they're saying these are female eligibility regulations for athletes with differences in sex development. We have recently, I collaborated with the Human Rights Watch and we published a report on this. I'll just quickly show you the report. It's called They Are Chasing Us Away from Sport. And this is about lived experiences of athletes with variations in sex characteristics. And what happens here is young women who are in sport are obviously, because we have the anti-doping structure, because they sort of feel in high performance sport, you have to constantly test athletes, ensure that no one is taking drugs to enhance their performance. That leads to other kinds of tests, often without consent of the athletes. Often athletes are asked to undergo certain tests which are not necessarily for anti-doping. For example, USG, ultrasonography, has nothing to do with doping. But athletes are asked to undergo ultrasonography, or even MRI or physical examination without explanation. Now, the other thing that I think is very important to mention here is how the sport structure is. Sport is an extremely hierarchical space where athletes are encouraged to be obedient. Athletes are encouraged to follow orders given by their coaches, by the officials. Sport is also very rule specific. So athletes are encouraged to follow rules. So in such an atmosphere where you're supposed to follow rules, you're supposed to be obedient to your coach, in such a sort of hierarchical space, it becomes really difficult for athletes to question or challenge any such sort of things. For example, USG, which she's asked to do, And that we have seen quite often. The other thing that I want to mention here is the dual loyalty of medical people. So as Dr. Aqsa just mentioned, we tend to go to medicine. We tend to look for answers from science. It's a different question whether science is going to provide us with answers or not. It's a different question whether science is at all neutral or not. But we do tend to look for answers from science. And it's the same in the case of sport. So whenever there is a confusion, whenever they feel that this woman is running too fast, there's, she needs to be scrutinized, she needs to be tested. They sort of send this woman to the medical doctors. And what happens in this case, we have seen that doctors have this dual loyalty where they're not only answerable to their patient, they're not only accountable to their patient, but they're also accountable to a third party, which is the federation, because the federation is involved in this whole process of testing. I can go on about it, but I think it's really important for you to see what really an athlete goes through. An athlete doing really well is often targeted, asked to undergo tests. There is this case of Anit Negesa, which I would want to refer to from Uganda, an athlete I have worked with very closely, still work with, who was tested right before the London Olympics because she was doing really well, and she was stopped from going to the London Olympics, tested, and then asked to undergo a surgery. So these regulations not only test your level of testosterone, not only try to check your chromosomes, not only do a physical examination to find out how your phenotype is, they also suggest, they also recommend medical interventions, and often not just recommend, but ask athletes that you will have to go through such medical intervention if you want to continue in sport. So often athletes feel they have no other way. It's an impossible choice for them, as Dr. Kirkazis and Morgan Carpenter, who co-wrote an article on this, says. I'll refer you to the video of Anit Negesa at this point. I think that is going to kind of give a fair amount of idea. If Dr. Sana, you think it's the right time to show a video, it's about 5 minutes long, so please bear with me.
South Korea was my first World Championship. I was very, very happy to go on with the sport and going to another level. Preparing for London Olympics, me plus my coach, we were working very hard so that our dreams comes true. Yeah, because our dream was to reach the finals. As long as we reach to the finals, yeah, anything can happen there. Some few weeks to the departure for the London Olympics, that's the time when I received the call from my international manager telling me my blood sample, they're having some problem, technical problem, and you can't go for the competition. My local officials from my federation told me that you have to stay home, not moving. Yeah. And if anyone asks you, tell them that you have an injury whereby I was a person who is injury free. However, you know I wasn't sick. One official from the IAAF, he tried to reach me, and after some few weeks, I think, they had me travel to go to Nice for body checkup, like measuring my whole body, and putting me into machine, yeah. Just like scanning me, the whole body, and getting more other blood samples from me. Yeah, it was something which was really confused. Like as if there were people who are not talking straight to you, telling you that this and this like this, yeah? But just telling you, do this, do this, do this, yeah? going to a doctor with an executive from the federation because she was with me, escorting me, going to the hospital. They took me to the operation room and they said that they're going to use the injection thing, whereby waking up, finding myself I'm having cuts. I say, whoa, they've done something which we didn't agree on. Yeah. And really, I was so scared. The people who were there with me, taking me to the hospital, who wanted me to do such. After the operation, no one came back to me to see what's really. No one came in to do a follow-up. No one explained to me what's really the truth. It was something which was just making me to go in that trap. I call it trap because it was a trap. Yeah. It took me 7 years without nothing. As in, they didn't give me straight information that after the surgery you have to go for hormone throughout the whole of your life. Yeah. Really, that was so hard on me. For 7 years, no one is coming to look for you. For 7 years, no one is minding to know where you are. Yeah. It was really a strange life.
As soon as you pass here, you start slowing down the pace. Don't sort of focus on the stride length. Okay. Keep the body moving. You know what I mean? That you feel that the body is moving at the same pace. Yeah.
Why are they focusing too much to people of the southern continent? Yeah, that shows that you're discriminating and racism in the sport, because all of us, we are human beings and we are females. Yeah. What I can say, let them stop taking people's or playing on people's bodies. Yeah, making people to be guinea pigs and doing their research on human beings and violating human rights. Yeah. My dream at first was taken away from me, but with God I trust that it will come back to me. And now I came back for training and I'm already in the process. I'm working for it again. I have to fight for my dream. I have to fight for it. That's my future now. I'm focusing on my dream, which was taken away from the IAAF regulations.
Thank you, Payoshni, for screening that film. I think it was really powerful and illustrated so emphatically the kind of chaos that this sort of arbitrary categorization can bring about in people's lives, and especially when it is in a very hierarchical setting. One can probably not see a way out of it. So on that note, I want to move on to what are the ways in which people are pushing back against this? What are the ways in which people are trying to bring about change, both from within the medical profession as well as from outside of it? So I will once again go back to Sanjida and ask her to speak very quickly about the kind of work that Sehat has been doing with the medical colleges and students and so on. I'm going to be a little bit more strict about time. So I'll give you each about 3 to 4 minutes, and please excuse me if I interrupt you and request you to stop, because we also have questions coming in and I'd like to give that enough time towards the end. So yeah, let's get started with Sanjida Arora.
Okay, thanks, Sana. So talking about Sehat's effects, I would say that there are two kind of approaches. One is upstream and one is downstream. So these are the terms used in the public health. When it comes to the downstream approach, it's about training of the in-service healthcare providers on providing comprehensive response to women facing violence, right? And while establishing such a response, the main focus of the Sehat is not to create something which is separate or standalone, like for example a separate department to address the issue of the domestic violence. No, the intention was not to medicalize the issue, but to build the capacity of the providers in a way so that it is identification of the women facing violence is routinely integrated in their clinical practice based on certain signs and symptoms, right? Like for example, women coming with a repeated pregnancy, having an inquiry with them, is there some problem at home, or the women coming with the repeated RTI or the STI. Yeah, so the approach is to integrate it into the routine clinical practice, and treating the women or the patient as a whole rather than just providing the symptomatic relief. The other approach I spoke about was the upstream approach, where Sehat worked with the medical educators and the medical colleges in Maharashtra. So if we look at the medical textbooks, there are lot of biases, and unscientific practices in the medical textbook. Just to give an example, like the forensic textbook talks about, the two-finger test or the comment on the hymen. Unfortunately, the law got changed, but the medical textbooks, they have not advanced with the time. So what we did is that we reviewed the medical textbooks, and then we identified the places where that there was a scope to integrate the gender sensitive content. And then we approached the medical educators, and we first had a consultation with them, and they the content, the identification of the content and the places where it can be integrated was jointly done by the medical educators and the Sehat team. Because we thought that if it will be like a outside thing, that it's going to it will fail. So we involved them from the beginning. They identified the places. And the other approach that was very specific here was that we didn't want to have a separate content curriculum, gender sensitive curriculum. We wanted to integrate into the existing curriculum, because a lot of research is there that what are the barriers for this, and they always say that the medical curriculum is huge. There is no scope to have this thing. So what we did is that the existing curriculum, and just added the content based on that existing curriculum from a gender sensitive lens. And not only the gender sensitive lens, but also we thought that let's have also use the intersectionality approach, where the same thing I said, that the social determinants of the health. And the focus was on the medical educators. We thought that the medical educators will be trained to teach such a content, then they will be able to deliver it in the classrooms, and then it will have an impact on the students they will teach, and also thereby the clinical practices. And we found out that the college where we implemented this, the medical educators or the head of the department were also able to bring changes in the clinical practice. Like, just to give you an example, the name of the department was changed from family planning to the contraceptive services for all. The earlier name was the family planning department, and they changed the name to the contraceptive services for all. And then also they were able to implement the respectful maternity care, allowing the birth companions, providing the curtains in the department for ensuring privacy and confidentiality. I have a video, but I'm not sure, Sana, how much time is there. So probably I can request tech team to paste the link in the section, and then people who are interested can watch it.
Yeah, I think that's a good idea, because we may not have time to run through the entire video, but I do recommend that everyone watch it if you can. And of course, Sehat's work is also available on the website of the organization, so you can take a look at that as well. Thanks so much, Sanjida. I think the efforts to reform textbooks and so on especially are far, they're extremely urgent now because they haven't been revised in so long. I find it quite strange that the editions of medical textbooks are so careful to change what they see as important. For instance, the kinds of treatments, procedures, prescriptions, and so on. But I remember reading the textbook of forensic medicine and toxicology, and at least until 2013-14, it still talked of lesbianism, for example, as a perversion, and had all sorts of stories about how they are homicidal and jealous and all sorts of things. So yeah, I think the reform is greatly overdue. So that's, extremely important work. Moving on to Dr. Aqsa, since you are also a medical practitioner, perhaps you could throw some light on what you think a queer affirmative medical practice would or should take the form of, and what are the kinds of efforts both from within the medical community, but also I think a lot of the shift in discourse that one has seen around gender binaries, etc., owes a lot to the queer community itself. So if you could talk a little bit more about those efforts, that would be great.
Yeah. When it comes to the efforts by the community, I would like to say that it's a great effort by both the transgender and the intersex community in ensuring that we are not reduced to our bodies. I'll give a couple of examples. So India is one of those few countries, and especially the state of Tamil Nadu, which has put a ban on unnecessary sex normalizing surgeries on intersex persons. Not sure how much of that has really started on the ground, but at least there has been a step by the court and by the government through a government order. And Delhi, through Delhi Committee for Prevention of Child Rights, for Protection of Child Rights, ordered the Delhi government to ban unnecessary sex normalizing surgeries on intersex children unless it is life-saving. So these are two examples, where the community has ensured legal protection against the injustices. When it comes to the trans persons, the Transgender Protection Act has gone through several amendments. And one such amendment was the self-determination of the trans persons. So in the previous version of the act, a transgender person, to prove that they are transgender and to get a certificate, were to go through a medical examination. And only when satisfied, by the district magistrate, they would be issued a certificate. Now that has been changed to an affidavit, which is signed by the transgender person saying that they are trans, and that is sufficient. The medical examination part has been removed. Second important change which has happened in the act is that previously the act wanted sex reassignment surgeries or genital surgeries to happen before the legal gender change could be done. Now it mentions procedure instead of surgery. So in the case of trans men, it could be simply mastectomy rather than a bottom surgery, which can be done, so which is less complicated and less expensive, and sometimes what the community needs. So that's another example. You have also the standards of care called WPATH, or the World Professional Association for Transgender Health, which releases the standards of care. And the standards of care mention how transition services have to be delivered. And one of those clauses talks about real life experience. So basically a trans person, living socially as the person with the gender identity they identify with. So example, if I identify as a trans woman, I'm supposed to live as a woman, dress up as a woman, talk as a woman, and for a period of at least 6 months before I can be given a certificate to start my hormonal therapy or my surgery. Now, this is again, which is something which has been pushed back and, by the trans community, saying that it is there is a life to threat of the trans persons. I mean, imagine if I dress up as a woman and I visit women's toilet, and I'm someone with a beard, I'm someone with male organs, and I'm caught in the women's toilet, then the consequences can be bad. So there are violent consequences, and our society is currently not prepared, and therefore one has to be in sync with the different geographical conditions in a country, and that's what is another example of how they have been pushing. And a very important pushback is against the mental health experts who have been doling out these certificates of gender identity disorder. Fortunately, in the DSM and the International Classification of Diseases, transness is no longer considered as a pathology. Homosexuality is no longer considered as a pathology, but still there are psychiatrists who believe in this business of certificates and who are still practicing conversion therapy that has been banned by multiple courts now. And the queer affirmative counseling practice is something which comes, as a great solace to the queer community here. This is something which is provided by the queer community by themselves. It is established by them, and it looks at role models from the community. It looks at empathy as a great factor, for providing that counseling, as against the mental health experts, where it is an us versus them approach which is in place. So the queer affirmative counseling practice has been gaining a lot of ground and acceptance in the queer community, and it's also getting slowly accepted by the mental health experts as a valid form of mental health.
I think a lot of these things that you've spoken about are oftentimes not even known to those who are practicing it. And it's not like it's a question of ignorance, but the fact that these sort of advances have been made in the way we think about trans health and care, I think is something that a lot of practitioners need to know about. And over a period of time, I think that will also bring about a change in how they think about what is normal and abnormal. Thanks so much for bringing that up and for enlightening us. I was also not aware of a few of those facts. Quite fascinating, and I think so much of this struggle is owed to folks who have been consistently working within and outside the system. Payoshni, if you can give a sense of what are the kinds of efforts, similar efforts being made within the sports fraternity, and perhaps also the challenges to organizing athletes in this way, because like we saw in the video, there seems to be complete isolation. And I'm sure that organizing and building solidarity among athletes must be quite a challenge as well. But what are some of the advances that you think have been made in that space and also in the general discourse around sports?
Thank you, Sana. As we have seen, Annette Negesa was talking about 2012. Much has happened since 2012, but still we haven't been able to reach every athlete who's going through similar kind of situations. But having said that, since the time when Castro Semenya was first tested and around when she won the Berlin World Championships in 2009, much has happened, and all of us, we owe a lot to these athletes, to champion athletes, whose stories probably were leaked to the media. But at the same time, they resisted. They stood up for their rights. Castro is one such athlete. Duti Chand from India is one such athlete. Excuse me. So, for example, Duti Chand was the first athlete to challenge regulations at the core of arbitration for sport in Lausanne. First athlete across the world to challenge the regulations. To be able to do that, to be able to challenge against the regulations, that's something that doesn't come very easily among athletes because of the very hierarchical system that I mentioned before. But they have been able to do that, and that has helped a lot. The fact that Annette Negesa wasn't able to speak in front of anyone, she was asked to hide this whole thing, and she did sort of, quote unquote, disappear from the circuit for 7 years until I reached out to her through another athlete in 2019. So we have seen that, but then Annette now for the last couple of years have been speaking out, talking in conferences to the media, also talking to current athletes who are going through similar kind of situations. So that has been very helpful. But also while these athletes have been very vocal, some of us across the world, we created our alliances with legal activists, scholars, bioethicists, raising questions about human rights violations in sport. And it has really changed, this sort of, the way these issues were being discussed in the context of sport, in sport, media, has changed over a period of time. And now we have the World Medical Association saying that these regulations should be banned, asking medical practitioners across the world to not help implement these regulations, which force surgery and other kind of invasive medical intervention on athletes just because they want to compete in high performance sport. So we have seen World Medical Association taking action. Now you see that people like me who have been working on this for a long time could collaborate with an organization like Human Rights Watch to write a report, to create videos like this that I just showed was the Human Rights Watch video, and also other organizations like OHCHR, United Nations Human Rights Council, the Council of Europe. Lots of human rights organizations coming forward, talking about it. And we are currently, Castus Mene is currently at the European Court of Human Rights, fighting that case, her case, and fighting this particular issue. So we have moved on because of the resistance, mainly by these sort of champion athletes, but also a lot of us who came together. So the idea of collectivity that you were talking about, Sana, it's difficult in sport because sport is such an individual pursuit where athletes just think about their own excellence. They just sort of are focused on their own career. So it's difficult to create those collectives in sport, and I struggle with that as an activist in this field. But at the same time, I think we have been able to make some really, interesting steps forward. And have been pushing these sport governing bodies to be more responsible and at least ensure that they don't cause harm when they're regulating, right? If you have regulations, you need regulations for some reason, you don't cause harm. At least that much should be ensured.
Yeah. I find it, I feel like there's an entire thread of what this role of that health professional is in all of these spaces. And when we were speaking in preparation for this, I remember you spoke about the fact that there's this constant gaze of suspicion that somebody is trying to game the system. And I feel like that is how it is also in the healthcare professional, where you want all these sort of validating a test or some kind of proof that what this person is saying is really the truth, because their word cannot be taken for it. And the role of the health provider is then also the person who's going to certify whether this person is saying the truth or not. And I remember while working on sexual assault and sexual violence, this used to often be a point of contention, because the healthcare provider, where does the loyalty of the healthcare provider lie? It's supposed to lie towards the patient, but then there are all of these other forces which see the provider as somebody who can give them the right answer and give them a sort of objective opinion on this matter, which is oftentimes, bringing in that element of suspicion in when healthcare providers also interact with patients. And that seems to be a role that they are playing in a lot of public policy, the way Dr. Aqsa also spoke about the whole issue with conversion therapy and things like that. Obviously, it is not the person who they are treating that they are concerned about, but they're playing a larger role that society and the system, in a sense, expects them to play as gatekeepers of what is allowed to be normal and what is not allowed to be normal. So I feel like there's a more philosophical question of what the whole role of medical science and medical professionals should be in society per se. And there has certainly been a shift. I remember you spoke about the World Medical Association's statement on this matter, which I think is an important step forward as well. But only when I think unless there's more engagement with health professionals on the ground for to also, make sure that everybody knows that this profession is changing and there are many ways of thinking about some of these things. That project will remain unfinished. And I think work like Sehat's work, for example, which is indirectly working with health professionals, has a role to play in doing that as well. So we will move towards the Q&A now, because we have about a little less than half an hour left to wrap up. There were some questions that came up, some of which have been answered. One was directed at Dr. Sanjida from Gurpriya Singh in Patna, who says that we have been running an ongoing campaign called Khud Se Pooche, and ask for women to come forward and start sharing and speaking up about the experience that they have in healthcare, and the lack of dignity in this experience. And she was keen to know what will be the way forward for the healthcare fraternity. I think Sanjida has been able to answer that to some extent, but Sanjida, if there's anything more that you'd like to add to that, please feel free to do so. There was a comment from Hansa about the video that we saw, and she rightly says that this is the worst of medical practice, very Nazi-like, and that it goes unpunished, that the individual has to make the effort to just somehow hold on to dreams and move on, and fight a very difficult fight, which is very distressing, absolutely. And there was one more question also for Payoshni, which is quite, you spoke a little bit about abolishing gender tests in sports, which is one of the questions, but also what are the repercussions of having events that are not gender divided at all? Should we start with Payoshni, and in the meanwhile, we can wait for more questions. You're on mute, Payoshni.
I think what Rigved is asking, I see, is so what is the possible solution for abolishing gender tests in sport, and what are the repercussions of having events that are not gender divided? So there are some events which are mixed in sport. If you think about equestrian has mixed sort of competition. If you think about some of the recent introduction of mixed relay, you see men and women running together. So there are all these interesting changes that are now taking place. And then there is this introduction of non-binary sport. In certain parts of the world, we see more and more where you don't have the binary model, so anyone can compete at any level. The other thing that sport often has in certain kind of sport, that is, like for example in wrestling or in boxing, you will see there are specific weight categories on the basis of which you can compete. So you can compete if you are under 55 or over 50. So you have these weight categories. So there are other physical traits on the basis of which you have these different kind of categories, and not necessarily always about sex. So there are these questions being asked about whether it's probably the right way forward to have categories on the basis of weight, height, strength, speed, different kinds of parameters really. And that you see a lot in Paralympics, for example, where there is a different levels and different kinds of parameters taken into account, and you have a very complex structure of competition. But having said that, is that the solution? Are we talking about that? We're talking about sport, and sport is a human right. And the IOC fundamental principles mentioned that sport is, everyone should have the right to play sport. Now, the question is whether everyone has the right to compete in sport. That is a question that's often asked nowadays. But what, as activists in the field, we are now focusing on is, yes, everyone has a right to compete and participate in sport, but at the same time, everyone has a right to bodily autonomy, everyone has a right to privacy, everyone has a right to employment, everyone has a right to dignity. Now, these are all the rights that are violated when you have the system of gender verification test, as we knew it earlier, and now we call it female eligibility regulations, and under which we do these investigations. I don't, sport does. So we need to sort of, look at that. They need to ensure that sport is a safe space. And I hope the sport governing bodies, and as of now, there are quite a few steps taken, as I just mentioned, but also the International Olympic Committee, for example, is working on an inclusion framework. And for the first time, they're trying to move away from how they have looked at this issue forever, like from a medical lens. For the first time, they are emphasizing human rights. For the first time, they're saying inclusion is a priority. So I'm sort of, hopeful with a few changes that's happening, but then there are also some governing bodies like World Athletics who are resisting such changes. So you have a bit of all. And, as activists, you are supposed to write for tomorrow. So you keep hoping that things will change.
Yeah. Absolutely. Sanjida, there was that one question about what is the way forward for healthcare, but there's also another one, which is from Nandini from ASAP. And she asks, hi, since domestic violence is criminalized, it can be more difficult for those experiencing it to seek medical services in order to avoid reporting abusive spouses or partners who may be the main provider. Is that a conversation that is happening in that direction as well? And how do we sensitize medical and other services to support those who are surviving domestic violence better? If you could take that up, we'll then wait for more questions.
Okay, so there are lots of research studies which, highlight that a survivor of violence is more likely to visit a health facility and share her experience with a healthcare provider rather than a police or the other standalone support services, because she is unlikely to go to the police or to seek support or to any standalone NGO. Or the other thing, the health system is considered as a safe space for the women to access the healthcare services for the consequences of the violence, and also there is a window of opportunity for the health system to intervene and link the women with the support services, right? Because the abuser will, if she is going to a police station, then the abuser will come to know that she is taking an action, but the women will have interface with the health system at various opportunities, like for example, for the routine antenatal care or for the childbirth or for the immunization of the children. So all these interfaces with the health system offers opportunity for the health system to intervene and inquire women about violence based on certain signs and symptoms, right? And so this comes to so this is regarding Nandini's question, whether the health system is a safe space or whether they would like to disclose or not. And the other thing I would like to say that we did a implementation research into medical colleges of Maharashtra, where we trained providers to identify women facing violence based on signs and symptoms. And then at the same time, the existing social workers in the hospital were trained to provide the first line support to the women, right? So that, because the doctors, they somehow know that the health complaints of the women are not, because of the history that she's giving, but, there's something that she's hiding. If they identify them and just give 2 or 3 messages that support services are available, this is a safe space, you are not at fault what you are experiencing, and then can refer to the department social worker. And then we at the same time empowered the social workers to link the women with the support services which are out of the scope of the hospital, like for example shelter or connected to the protection officer, right? So even this messaging kind of thing that she is not at fault, addressing the self-blame feelings and all, can do wonders as far as the consequence of violence on the health of women is concerned. She might not seek support immediately, but one day after 3 or 6 months, she will definitely come and say that now I want to seek support service. So
right.
Yeah,
I think that's also the reason why that there's a role for the healthcare provider in the Protection of Women from Domestic Violence Act, and that is one of those things that has taken very long to percolate and is slowly happening through various efforts, but a long way to go there as well. One more question for Payoshni, which is that what do you think makes certain sporting communities and authorities more likely to adopt a non-gender segregated format? Thinking about something like ultimate frisbee versus, say, cricket or football here, frisbee, which is non-gender segregated in a lot of places.
Sports, there are different kinds of sport. It really depends on that as well. For example, we do sort of discuss athletics a lot because the World Athletics has been at the forefront of making these regulations for decades. But if you look at what World Rugby, I don't know if any of you follow World Rugby. World Rugby has recently done. They have been talking about safety in the field. They have been talking about collision, etc. in the field. And on the basis of that, they have come up with this most exclusionary guidelines, as far as especially trans inclusion is concerned. So, which is really worrying because even within the trans population, there is a diversity of, women. Even within, for example, even if you talk about cisgender women, there is a lot of diversity within that population as far as strength, height, speed is concerned. So these kind of regulations need, at this point, I think the first thing that we need to do is ensure that inclusion is prioritized, which is often not the case. So one sport to another, there could be different things. One of my, colleagues and friend, Katrina Kurkazis, works on testosterone, and she and Rebecca John-Young wrote a book together on testosterone, and she says that testosterone does not necessarily impact, or all your tissues and muscles don't respond the same way to your high level of testosterone. Again, different bodies, different people will respond to the high level of testosterone differently. So it's a very complex structure. It's so difficult to sort of find evidence about competitive advantage. And sport in itself is so diverse as well. Human bodies are so diverse. No two babies are born exactly the same. So you have so many sort of different kind of parameters to try and sort of get a standard, make a standard is, I think, a futile effort. What you need to rather focus on is a culture of sport where everyone is enjoying sport, having fun, even in competition. And it's not based on the kind of culture of suspicion that I spoke to you about previously, which you mentioned, Sana. If we can let go of that culture of suspicion in high performance sport, I think we can make sport a much safer and welcoming space. That is very important. I don't know if I answered the question that you were just asking, but these are my thoughts.
Yeah, I think it's also a question of the question itself, I think, was also about culture and the fact that, this is a layperson sort of view on it, which is that there's so much of competitiveness attached to something like football or cricket in a more, also in a popular culture sense. And the idea of competition is, the idea is competition rather than enjoyment of the match. And I think that also brings in this whole thing about what is competitive advantage and who has it. And, it's so cutthroat that I'm sure that has a role to play. But I think that's what you're asking for is a larger change in how we view sports in our worlds. Unfortunately, a lot of it is built into national identities and such at the moment. So I suppose that has its own set of challenges too. I had a question for Dr. Aqsa, which was that being somebody from within the profession who's been pushing for this kind of change, what is the kind of critical mass that you see in the profession that is trying to push for change along with you? Either trans professionals themselves, which I know there are very few of, who are out, and what are some of the challenges in kind of, garnering that support? From the outside, there is a lot, but what does it feel like from within?
Yeah. So again, giving a personal example, I came out as a trans person around 17 years back in my college. when I was in the third year of MBBS. And I remember that, when I revealed that to my batchmates, I could not speak about it. So I just wrote down that on a chit and, shared that with them. And they replied back through a chit. And we never had a conversation after that for the next 3 years for which I was in the college. The same thing happened during my postgraduate days. Now I had more voice and I could talk about them, that I identify as a trans person. But again, there was this entire culture of do not ask and do not tell, do not discuss about this. Okay, we understand that you're a trans person, end of the story. No further, discussion on it. And that was the kind of hush-hush culture also amongst the faculty members. Fortunately, that has changed completely. So now, almost 2 decades down the line, I'm writing for my own alma mater about, gender identity amongst the students and how the teachers and colleagues can support them. I'm very happy that I got invited by my own college to speak about it, and that there is a society which a queer club in my same college, in the college in which I found it to be extremely transphobic and queerphobic at one point of time. So I think the credit completely goes to the younger generation, who has now been more exposed to the issues around gender identity and sexual orientation through media, through Netflix, let's understand it has through Twitter. It has had a great impact, and now people are talking about it, and there are a lot many allies. Previously, 20 years down back, it was pathologized and it was also illegal. So as of today, it's depathologized, it's also legal, and therefore now people are talking about it. And therefore, as a trans person, I find it extremely, I find it very happy and glad that now the medical colleges are becoming the safe spaces that they ought to be.
Yeah, I had a similar question for Dr. Sanjida as well while you were speaking, that, you spoke about the fact that you're working with healthcare providers and educators and such. And with gender, it's not like it's something new. Integrating gender into health programs, etc., has been on something as mainstream as the World Health Organization has been talking about since the 80s. So it's taken a long time for it to come to the medical profession in terms of the educators and for changing practice. So what is the kind of pushback that you faced when you all started doing this work, and what do you think continue to be some of the challenges that you see even now?
Yeah, so that we engage with the healthcare providers in terms of building their capacity and also, change in the attitude. But the change in the attitude doesn't happen overnight, right? So it requires continuous engagement, and we run several courses with healthcare providers on not even on the gender, but also on the aspects like caste, class, and religion, right? And also something about reservations in the medical education. So just to give an example, whenever there is a session on the reservations in the medical education, the most sensitive healthcare providers even come forward and they say that this is wrong or what. So I agree that bringing a change is very difficult, especially when the providers are also the part of this society. But the key is to have continuous engagement. And one thing I would like to highlight is that the medical education is highly technical and based on the scientific content. There is no content on the humanities as far as the Indian medical education is there. And if seen the newspapers and all, we have seen several incidents where the patients are beating up the doctors, right? Because the doctors are not trained to even disclose bad news to the relatives, or even to have a effective communications with the relatives of the family, or even with the patient. Yeah, so this is just an example to show that what is lacking in our medical education.
Yeah, Payoshni, did you want to add something?
Yeah, I think I want to add to both Dr. Sanjida's point about the little the issues that we face constantly with doctors and the lack of bioethical concerns or bioethical sort of discussions, conversations within the medical fraternity. So that is one of the points that even I constantly see in sport. I'm currently dealing with things where even the regulations that we are they are not really, they don't discuss them, they don't understand them, and they just keep working how they have worked traditionally, whereas the regulations are changed internationally. And it also about the international federations not communicating it to the doctors in the national sporting ministries or federations. But I also wanted to come to what Dr. Aqsa was saying, the beautiful story of going back to the college and sort of speaking. And that reminds me of one instance where I have one of my, the sort of trans activist friends. She's wonderful. She speaks so well. So I was always often consulted by the Sports Authority of India, Calcutta, for their annual, sexual abuse, sort of, awareness kind of a workshop, and they would always ask me for, advisors who can come and speak. I was almost always invited, but the others who could come, and I would from the year one, I tried to say that I want this person, this friend of mine, this fantastic speaker, to come, and every year for 5 years, it was like, I don't think we are ready for this. Okay, I don't think we are ready for this. And then finally in 2019, when I was here the last time, they asked me to come do that, and I said, can I get heard this time? And they said yes. And it was just fascinating. She spoke very well. This is my friend India and she speaks so well. And the NIS students, as well as the teachers, everyone loved it. But the fact that we are often not open to these discussions, we are not often not inviting people, we are not opening up enough. And if we do, it's such a different experience altogether. So Dr. Aqsa, your experience reminded me of how, me and my friend, we had this wonderful experience at the Sports Authority of India.
Yeah. I totally agree. I think that a lot of us, when we went to medical college or dental college or what have you, had a very different environment. Where I went to college, girls weren't even allowed to wear pants in some of the places. In some of, when you were posted in certain departments, you had to be dressed in not just feminine clothing, but Indian modest feminine clothing. And when I think about why we never said anything about it, it just seems ridiculous that we didn't. But at the time, there was, one was not as politicized oneself, but I think there's also been a change in the outside environment of very strongly saying that these are things that are unacceptable. So on that note, I think a very positive note, looking forward to the future and demedicalizing and depathologizing all kinds of things that bring diversity into this beautiful world. We will stop our session here. Thank you everyone for joining and for participating, and thank you to the audience for staying with us for the past 90 minutes. I will now hand back over to Souvik. Thanks so much.